we don't know how long for. How can the taxpayer be sure that they've got bang for their buck?
That's the million-dollar question, or rather the billion-dollar question in today's currency. We need to keep people in work. There is an eye-watering amount of debt that we've had to take on in order to deal with the coronavirus. But if we do not keep people in work, keep people being economically active, providing for their families, for their communities, then the alternative is this unemployment death spiral, which we do not want to even face. So whilst we've got this leveraged economy, this high level of debt, high level of borrowing, we need to make sure that we're totally focused on jobs, growth and investment.
But you're adding to the borrowing by effectively bunging money to companies to locate here. I'm delighted that Nissan are expanding. I'm delighted that Vauxhall are expanding. But what, as Claire says, why do you think that they deserve taxpayer subsidies rather than other sectors of the economy?
Well, so the alternative to that economic death spiral of unemployment and lack of investment is our plan for the future. It is a plan for global Britain, where we have growth, we have prosperity, we have productivity, we are a leading global player. And so, yes, we are supporting businesses, we are getting inward investment from foreign countries into the UK at this point, but it is because we believe our plan will work, and we believe that ultimately, as we cautiously unlock, supported by the vaccines programme, the hard work of the British people will grow our economy, will create more tax revenue, and it will ultimately lead us to our leading position in the world.
Andy McDonald, I imagine if there had been a Corbyn government now, that similar things would be being done. It seems very odd for a Conservative government to adopt Corbynomics in a way, doesn't it?
Well, an intervening state is clearly the order of the day, and I would support for our automotive industry. It's got to make that transition to green technologies. But I do ask myself whether it's sufficient. If we look at other comparative jurisdictions in Germany and France, the investment in green technologies is significantly higher than it is here. But I think Claire raises an interesting point about where is the support for other sectors of the economy. And of course, many promises were made in terms of fishers and farmers, and the government will have to answer as to why that level of support isn't there. But returning to the investment, I mean, in my part of the world, Nissan is a massive employer. There's been about 29,000 people dependent upon that single plant. So it's critically important that it is sustained. That was always my concern, that as we left the European Union, that we did so in a way that avoided a no deal, so that we didn't entertain tariffs, because that could have led to the loss of that plant and many more. But I welcome the support for the automotive industry. I just wish the government would support GKN in Erdington, because that is a critical part of our automotive industry, and we look to lose 590 jobs there. And I trust that the government will think again about what support it can give to that critical element of our automotive industry. But there is a role for government, and it would be churlish of me not to welcome the government coming forward and making these investments, and that's exactly what it should be doing.
Is it true that these sorts of subsidies we could not have done this had we still been members of the European Union? Isn't it crucial that we actually left the EU so these sorts of things could happen? I mean, I always feel uncomfortable about subsidies, but the truth is that Nissan might not be building this factory in your region. Vauxhall might not be protecting these jobs in the Northwest had we still been in the EU.
But they did, Iain. That's exactly what the government did do with Nissan when they built the advanced manufacturing park next door. Greg was on earlier. I think good question to ask Greg Clark, how much was directed Nissan's way to secure that investment. So it did happen whilst we were in the European Union. And it's often held out as being the fetter and the block to do all manner of things. But I'm afraid that it just simply was never the case. The ability of the government to take a more active role was there. The European Union was often used as an excuse for not doing so.
Yasmine Ahmed, what do you think about this? Are you concerned that, like Claire, our questioner, that a lot of money is going to some sectors but nothing to others?
Well, for Human Rights Watch, we take a as sort of an approach where we look at the kind of a rights-based approach to some of these issues. And in particular, for Human Rights Watch, what we were very concerned about, in addition, obviously, to concerns about jobs and investment and people's rights to livelihood, which we have done work on in terms of access to food and access to housing and other things. We're also very concerned in context of Brexit that the rights that were enshrined within the EU system, particularly workers' rights, environmental rights, privacy rights, continued to be protected when post-Brexit as well. So that's something that we at Human Rights Watch have been really focused on. But I think, and really focused on the question as well of what does global Britain actually mean? And are we ensuring the best interests of the UK domestically and internationally through our investments and through the rights that are being protected?
In terms of employment rights, I mean, obviously this is Andy's specialist area, but there's little evidence so far that the government is trying to change any of the employment legislation and the rights that British workers enjoy. And in fact, many of the rights that British workers enjoy are far in excess of European standards.
Oh, I think I'd challenge you on that, Ian. Of course, there's every intention to water down workers' rights. We saw that from Kwasi Kwarteng early days when he took up the post. We saw his book, Britannia Unchained, and what they really wanted to do was remove the cap on work on hours at work, to deal with breaks at work and how holiday pay was calculated. It was shunted off to Ian Duncan Smith's regulatory review programme, so it hasn't gone away. And do remember that the government stood on a platform to bring forward an employment bill to make Britain the best place in the world to work. Well, amen to that, but I see no evidence of it. Just look at what's happened over fire and rehire when the government has sat on its hands and companies have used the cover of COVID to do what they wanted to do always, which was to reduce terms and conditions, to have people working for longer, for less pay. And quite frankly, they've been exposed. They've no intention to enhance workers' rights. Okay. And I'm afraid, given the inability of people to stand up and have a voice in the workplace, there's an awful lot of work to do in our country.
Jamie and Njoku-Goodwin, let's not talk about UK music on this. Let's think back to your time in government. I mean, were you party to any of these discussions about what should happen about workers' rights after Brexit? Because the government insists that they're not going to reduce workers' rights, but Andy seems to think they are.
I was never party to any conversations towards that, I'm afraid. Look, I think on the question itself, we live in a global economy, and I agree with Ben to an extent. You need to be looking at those sectors where you can be internationally competitive. If we're looking to build back better, as seems to be the buzzword at the moment, you need to be looking at how you can be supporting jobs, how you can be supporting growth, and looking at the sectors where you can have a natural competitive advantage, where as a country we are succeeding. I'd probably add a sector to Claire's list, and that is the music industry. Before the pandemic, we were a £5.8 billion industry, supporting 200,000 jobs, £2.9 billion of exports. Post-Brexit, there have been a lot of challenges for our industry. Musicians across the country are struggling to get visas. They're finding it difficult to tour. And I hope we can sort of see if government policy at the moment is look at the sectors where we think we've got a natural advantage, look at the sectors where as a country we can be global Britain, we can be successful internationally.
So why, just on that, why are the governments so reluctant, it seems, to negotiate deals with various EU countries? Because I think this has to be done country by country, doesn't it? They've done one with Norway, where you think, well, if you can do one with Norway, why can't you do it with the rest?
It does. We've seen, actually, credit when government's doing trade deals with Norway, Liechtenstein, all these other countries. Again, Liechtenstein is not a major touring destination. But actually,
I've been there many times. Visit my money, ha.
But that's the point is, government has shown and actually set the precedent that you can get agreements for this.
Yeah.
And so the kind of...
So what's holding it back?
This is what we're asking government. They sort of, you speak to people in government, you hear government statements, select committees, the work Lord Foss is doing, that DCMS are doing. They're very clear they want to sort this. The Prime Minister at the liaison committee, I think 3 months ago, promise to fix it. They say they're doing this work, but actually for lots of musicians across the country, they're having gigs cancelled now, they're having events cancelled now. Yes, there's a pandemic, but lots of musicians, they plan these things years in advance.
But basically, if you live in Norway, you're going to see a lot of British bands over the next few months.
Well, look, we want British musicians to be touring as far as possible all across the world, post-pandemic, post-Brexit. This is hugely important for us.
And are we imposing those same restrictions on them?
So it's really important that what we're doing is reciprocal. Actually, this isn't sort of a competitive advantage. This is actually a lose-lose. It's in our interest to attract European talent to the UK. We've got a really vibrant live music industry that depends on talent from across Europe. We want to attract people from across the EU to come and work in the UK and perform in the UK and contribute towards our live music and cultural scene. And it's in the interests of British artists to be touring abroad, and it's in the interests of European capitals and countries across the EU to be attracting and enabling British artists to tour. So I think part of the frustration with this whole thing is that no one wins from not letting musicians tour, and it's absolutely vital that rather than having some sort of blame game as different sides seem to want to get into, or saying we're trying it, we just kind of get on with it and sort it as quickly as possible, because again, this isn't some sort of like Westminster game. There's hundreds of thousands of people whose jobs and livelihoods are depending on it.
Well, we strayed a little bit from the question. Claire, I'm not going to come back to you purely because you've kind of gave your opinion in the question anyway, so thank you very much for your contribution. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
What if the world listened more? Maybe it could become a better place.
From Human Rights Watch and Jamie and Njoku-Goodwin from UK Music are with me taking your calls. 0345 6060 973. We have got a couple of spaces if you want to phone in. Ben's in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello. I've got a question for basically mainly the Human Rights Watch person. The police and
all our questions go to all of our panellists. So.
Well, I know it does, but I knew she was on there, so I thought, well, she'll be an interesting answer.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry, I won't waste more of your time. The question is, the Police and Criminal Evidence Bill went through Parliament, and therefore making a noise during a demonstration can actually get you arrested. Or if you're a single person standing outside Parliament and protesting about something, they can then arrest you. And the attack upon human rights in this country started off with the
what's your question?
Snoopers Charter. So I would like your opinion on all of that, please.
Well, I'm going to sum that up. I think. I think the summary is: are we turning into more of a police state? Yasmine, I am going to come to you as UK Director of Human Rights Watch. I'm going to wind you up and let you go.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for the question. Yes, obviously we have very, very serious concerns about the restrictions that are being placed on right to association, freedom of assembly and free speech in the United Kingdom. And I think that certainly goes hand in hand with other measures that have been introduced by the UK government, which we see as sort of restricting and closing civic space, whether that's, in the space of protests and other areas. So, yeah, we're very, very concerned about that. And we have significant concerns about the undermining more generally of democratic norms and accountability for police and law enforcement.
When people talk about a police state, aren't they actually almost defeating their own arguments? Because anyone that tries to pretend that we are becoming like Russia or Belarus or all sorts of other countries, they're exaggerating an argument. I understand why they do it, but surely they defeat their own arguments by doing that.
Well, I think what's really important to note, and something that was picked up, in fact, by Ben, is we are global Britain, and we're presenting an image to the world of the kind of values that we think not only that we should have, but that we think the world should have. And one of those values is open democracy, free association, freedom of assembly. And obviously, it's very difficult for us to stand up on an international stage and tell Belarus that they're doing the wrong thing, to tell Russia that they're doing the wrong thing, when in our country, in the United Kingdom, there are severe restrictions on freedom of expression and association which are happening. And obviously, I don't need to remind yourselves or the listeners that it's only through the ability of people to assemble and associate and speak that we have had the suffragettes, and we've had, freedom for women to vote, that we've had trade unionism and protection of workers' rights. And so it's absolutely incredibly important for the very rights of ordinary people that we have these protections, and also the ability for us as the United Kingdom stand on an international stage and tell others that they should abide by these norms and international principles as well.
Ben Everitt, there are legitimate concerns about some of the clauses in this bill for restricting people's right to demonstrate, for instance. How can you justify that?
Well, I don't recognise the characterisation of severe restrictions on freedom of speech.
Yasmine just gave a few examples of which would mean that if I suddenly wanted to go and hold a placard up outside Parliament, I could be arrested for doing that. That's not what should happen in a democratic state.
So I'm not entirely sure that's what's happening with the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill. I mean, the major thrust of the bill is to tidy up areas of common law and criminal law to make sure that it's much clearer and simpler for the police to actually police these protests, which ultimately will make it more simple and more clear for protesters to actually go about their protests in a confident way, knowing that they're within the law. So I think when we make comparisons to what we're doing in the UK to be able to enforce the law in a sort of a sensible, proportionate way, versus other countries where you see these quite restrictive laws against protesting and actually quite punitive punishments for people that do protest, I think it's quite insulting. Actually, we do value the right to protest in the UK, and what we value most is the right to protest peacefully within the law and make it as simple and clear for the police to be able to do their job as well.
Just coming back to you, Yasmine, for a second, is Ben right there that we have one of the more liberal regimes for policing protests in Europe? We know how protests can sometimes be policed in France, Spain, Italy. Does he have a point, or do you look at countries like Scandinavian countries, Germany, Denmark, Holland, and you compare us with them, and we don't compare very favourably?
Well, I think that the key thresholds is whether we have laws that protect those rights. And as Ben rightly said, rights which can, in certain circumstances, be restricted when it's necessary for public order and public safety and other things. But what we are very, very concerned about, and certainly not making any comparison to say that the UK is as bad as Belarus or Russia, I think quite rightly that's an unfair comparison. But what we are saying is when there are provisions in legislation which provide discretion around a protest becoming too noisy and therefore being able to be restricted, we're very concerned about what that means in terms of the ability to protest and the subjective assessments as to what is too noisy, who is concerned about that. So what we're saying is, yes, in very extreme circumstances, there can be restrictions, but it shouldn't be in circumstances where, for example, the protest may be getting too loud. And I think that's really crucial because, as I've said before, the right to associate, the right to express one's opinion is the way that we as a populace, every one of us in the United Kingdom, has the ability to speak to power. And if we don't have the ability to speak to power, and if that is curbed, even in subtle ways, that has very reverberating consequences.
So in short, you're going to be all right to take your placard.
Okay, I'll try and think of something to protest about. Jamie, what do you think about this? Do you think that the right to protest is being unfairly restricted?
Look, I thought Yasmine is completely right. Protest is fundamental to a democracy. It's incredibly important. And the interesting thing about that conversation there is I don't think there's a big disagreement there. One of the big frustrations with some of these stories sometimes is that you take an edge case, for example, and you say this is going to be the absolute norm. When actually one of the most important things is how is this going to be implemented? How is this actually going to be the case? I don't think anyone wants to see a situation where someone standing outside Parliament is going to be stopped from doing so or stopped from holding up a placard.
Apart from Steve Bray, obviously. The Brexit protest.
And it depends what you've got on your placard.
Steve Bray has always been I don't agree with him on many things, but he's a very charming man, I will say. But I think Yasmine's completely right that how are you going to make sure that sort of like the extreme cases? I mean, because sometimes there are needs to be able to do some things like this in kind of very extreme cases. But it's absolutely important that you don't take legislation that is meant for extreme cases and allow that to become the norm across society.
Well, I guess there's also the balance between spontaneous demonstration and something that has to be planned months in advance. I think that is a really difficult one to get right. Andy McDonald, I'm imagining, I don't know why I imagine this, but you've been on a fair few protests in your time.
Yeah, right from the anti-apartheid movement and supporting the miners. And I would really be very, very worried about any erosion of the ability of the people of this country to protest in any way. The rights that we have secured have been hard won, and they've often been noisy and offensive and irritated the establishment mightily. You talk about Steve, who protests outside Parliament. Well, you may indeed find him irritating. But that's the whole point of protest, is to get your attention.
Particularly when you're broadcasting, he's irritating. I can tell you that for nothing.
I'm sure. But it's really serious, this, because I think this is a dangerous step for our democracy and our freedoms. And and it's part of our values that we speak up for the right to protest. And Yasmine's absolutely right. We hold ourselves out as a democratic beacon. If we're going to start eroding the ability of the people to protest and shout, it's a sad day for us. This will not end well. And of course, the powers that we're granting to the police in these circumstances, they've not been crying out for these powers. You're putting police in potential areas of conflict and tension that could otherwise be avoided, because we know about the British character. If you try to suppress the British people about speaking up, they will soon let you know that they're not having it. So I think this is not only an unnecessary step, but a very dangerous one. And when I look at the rights that we've won from time immemorial, any attempt to suppress that is going to end up very badly indeed. So I trust that the government will think again, because this is not needed. It's trying to solve a problem that is not there causing us issues at this moment. So why on earth do you want to embark upon such a programme?
OK, Ben, thanks for your question. Just to tell you that tomorrow night on Cross Question, we've got a specialist edition. We're going to just do international affairs. We've got a really good panel for you to answer questions on world affairs. So have a think about the questions that you want to ask for that. If you want to email them to me in advance, email Iain, IAIN, @lbc.co.uk. It's 8:30 on LBC, time for the news headlines with Lucinda Horsley.
Self-isolation rules will soon be a thing of the past for most people in England. From mid-August, under 18s and adults who have been fully vaccinated will only have to quarantine if they test positive. School classroom bubbles are being scrapped as well. A man's been found guilty of murdering two sisters in North London in a so-called pact with the devil to help him win the lottery. 19-year-old Daniel Hussein stabbed Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman in Wembley last June. Hundreds of jobs have been safeguarded at Vauxhall's Ellesmere Port plant. Electric vehicles are going to be built there. LBC weather, rain persisting over northern and eastern Scotland tonight. Drier and clearer elsewhere, especially across eastern England, a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC.
Andy McDonald, Ben Everitt, Yasmine, Ahmed and Jamie Njoku-Goodwin still with us to take more of your questions. 0345 6060 973. Alex is in Watford. Hello, Alex.
Good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. Does the panel view the recent government spending on the pandemic as reckless.
Jamie.
I think you've got to compare what the options you've got are. I think over the past year and a half, there have been lots of things that people thought was a huge waste of money. I remember a time when people were saying, why are you spending £50 million on a vaccine that we haven't sort of been proved to work yet, as is important. And actually the decisions you've got to be making and the balance you've got to say is, when you've got a pandemic that's costing your economy billions of pounds every day, the sooner you end it, every day you can bring that pandemic to an end, is billions and billions of pounds saved. And actually there's other countries, particularly in the vaccine, who you read some really horrifying accounts of countries that were sort of trying to save pennies on the cost of their vaccine, and it took them weeks and weeks and weeks longer to get their vaccines into people's arms just because they were trying to drive down the price. I think it's really important to be responsible with public spending and to spend taxpayers' money incredibly effectively. But when you're dealing with a pandemic, that the impact on lives, on the economy is so huge, taking decisions and spending money on things that may be a risk, may not come off, but actually if the kind of potential risk reward is saving lives, I think it's worth it. And I'm sure there'll be some examples of things that didn't come off and some examples of things that in isolation you could take out and say this was wasteful spending. But I think the approach government took over the past 18 months of take risks on things, spend money in the hope it comes off, that's given us one of the best vaccine programs in Europe. That's given us a testing capacity which is higher than many other countries. And I think on balance, while you can take individual examples of things that may not look like good value for money, overall, I think it has been.
You left the Department of Health long before the pandemic started. Is there any part of you that thinks, I wish I'd been there for this? Because I mean, to have some influence, I guess, as a special advisor, would have been quite something during the last 18 months. Probably 24-hour working days.
I was there for the first 10 months of it, actually. I only left in October.
My sense of time. I thought you went to the DCMS after that.
I started off at DCMS and then went to
I've got it the wrong way
DH. But no, it was incredible is the wrong word, but unimaginable period. I was only there for the first 10 months. There have been people who've been there for the full 18 months, working horrifically long days, having to make awful decisions in a world which you're basically being presented with bad options. And I think lots of people sometimes act as though the options you're being presented are, you could do this, Minister, which everything works perfectly, or you could do this, which everything doesn't. But actually you're being presented with awful options, and having to make really difficult decisions throughout the course of the pandemic. And it's a really tough one for all involved. And
you presumably witnessed all of the Dominic Cummings shenanigans, or when you watched his evidence in that select committee, did you think, well, this is not my recollection of events at all?
He said many interesting things about the pandemic. I was often thinking...
You've gone all defensive body language.
No, I was often thinking he said some very wise things. If only we had someone like him in government over the course of the pandemic, maybe things would have been better. But look, I think it's really important to take evidence on these things. I think it's really important to hear from people that have worked in government and worked on the course of this pandemic, because lots of people sometimes act like these things go around once every 100 years and we don't have to worry about the next one. If you look at loss of biodiversity, global travel trends, we may be seeing another one of these much sooner than we like. And I know it's a very depressing idea and a depressing thought for things, but actually it's not just an academic, let's look back at the last 18 months and see what went well, see what went badly. It's really important that we have a very clear idea of what we might have to do next time, because this pandemic has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, it's cost businesses, it's cost the economy, and anything we can do to make sure we're better prepared for next time, I think is in the national interest.
Final question on this. Dominic Cummings accused Matt Hancock of being a liar. You were with Matt Hancock through, as you say, the first 10 months. What was your experience of him?
So it was someone who, woke up every morning asking, what can I do to protect the NHS? And what can I do to protect lives? And often that means taking incredibly difficult decisions. But there are many things and many decisions he took that I think he will deserve great credit for. Kind of a focus on testing, when people were saying, actually, you're never going to boost your testing capacity, and people laughing at him saying, we're going to boost our testing capacity to ensure that you can be testing care homes, to ensure you can be testing asymptomatic carriers, and ensure you can be testing people on discharge, and that was achieved. And the vaccine, it's it's very strange going back through sort of old messages from the start of the pandemic and seeing conversations in January 2020 saying we've got to get on this now, we've got to make sure we get on this now, because every single day you can get a vaccine sooner, it's going to be lives that are going to be saved. And even as recently as October last year, people in Westminster were laughing at Matt, saying he's the only person who believes there's going to be a vaccine. Actually, a lot of the work he did, a lot of the work officials did, a lot of the work people across the NHS and fantastic people in NHS England and across the whole health and social care have made some incredible decisions which have saved people's lives.
Andy McDonald, let's go back to Alex's question. Does the panel view recent government spending on the pandemic as reckless?
I think some of the spending, Ian, has been worse than reckless. We've had 37 billion spent on PPE. Some of the ways in which contracts were commissioned and awarded just leave me cold. I mean, Jamie's done a great job to defend his former boss, but the use of private emails that is now being referred to the Information Commissioner's Office should concern us. And I think when this public inquiry ultimately sits, I think some of the issues that are going to be unearthed and exposed, because we know about a lot of them thus far. Pub landlords getting contracts for things they have absolutely no experience of. And when we have that sort of level of connectivity between people commissioning services, spending billions of pounds of taxpayers' money and rewarding friends and donors, it's worse than reckless. And I think this is going to haunt this government for the rest of its term. But some of the decision-making has clearly been appalling. You look no further than Boris Johnson's approach to our borders and allowing the Delta variant to come in. Whilst all that wonderful work is going on to get us vaccinated, we're getting decisions made by our Prime Minister and his colleagues that have exposed our country, and they've led to deaths. And they can never, ever be forgiven for having made such terrible, terrible mistakes. But the money being spent, there will be a day of reckoning on this, and they will be held accountable.
Jamie?
Yeah, I'm in a non-political role right now, so I'm not going to try and get into the politics of it. But there's just one point on PPE that I do want to come back to, because I remember what it was like in February and March, and you're hearing from doctors and nurses who are saying, we're worried we can't get PPE. And honestly, if then you'd have said, listen, there's this potential contract, but actually, can you spend another 2 weeks trying to drive the price down? Generally, I think that would have been immoral. If you've got a situation where you've got doctors and nurses who are potentially dying on the front line in a pandemic, where PPE is this life-saving gear, you should absolutely be doing anything you can to get PPE to them.
And perhaps asking, have they done it before? Have they got experience in providing PPE? Or is this a new venture that they're entering into for the very first time? These are the questions that I'd want to ask. And have we got British suppliers who can actually fulfil these orders right now, rather than hunting around for people who've never done it before? And that's why so much of it was trashed, and people were having to use all manner of means to create PPE in our hospital wards and our care homes. I'm afraid that won't wash, really, Jim. I know it's a great job you're doing defending the indefensible, but it is utterly indefensible what happened there.
Yasmine?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, certainly a higher degree of transparency is something that is needed, sort of echoing the concerns that Andy has raised about how the government did things, how they commissioned contracts and in what way, and certainly lessons learned. I think there are things that the government have done well, and there are certainly things that the government could learn from and do a lot better. And I think the need for greater transparency is definitely one of them. And in situations of public health emergencies, transparency to the public should be the number one principle, because we need to trust the government. And if there's anything that undermines that trust, it's not going to build public confidence. But I think in addition to that, I think the government should and continue and should be accredited for the furlough system and the fact that they have ensured that people have been able to maintain a reasonable standard of living and been able to feed themselves and have a home, and that should continue for as long as necessary. The other thing that I think is really important to note, though, is that in addition to the expenditure on COVID directly, what COVID certainly has done in a number of instances is expose the fractures in society. And I think this is something that the government really needs to grapple with. What we have seen during the pandemic is there has been a pandemic of violence against women in the home. And yet what we've seen by the government is which has been long running since the introduction of austerity, is the withdrawal of services and assistance to women who are seeking to leave situations of domestic violence. We've also seen, yes, a domestic violence bill which was introduced by the government, but that very bill left loopholes. So, for example,
it's a really important subject, but we are kind of drifting away from Alex's question on government spending. So, Yasmine, if you don't mind, I'm going to go to Ben. I mean, this is a difficult one, isn't it? Because obviously in a pandemic, the government has got to, I mean, we were talking about PPE just then. You want to get it as quickly as you can. Do you accept that corners were cut?
Well, so in answer directly to Alex's question, was the spending reckless? No, because we did what we needed to do to get the job done. And I think nobody would try to slow us down as doing what we did during the pandemic, trying to get the job done, trying to throw cash at developing a vaccine. As Jamie pointed out, 18 months before the vaccine's available, we're there funding that initial research to get ahead of the curve, to try and beat the virus, get that vaccine program.
And I understand why you want to look at one of the successes, but what about Andy McDonald's point about not enough checks were done? A lot of these contracts seem to be handed to friends of the government, shall we say, to put it at its kindest. Does that not concern you?
So, well, Jamie made a really good point about the moral case for speed in terms of every second we waste is a second we could be saving lives. And I, with respect to Andy, I think the points that he's made about the things he would have retrospectively asked about those contracts that were being laced would have slowed us down. This is a carnival of whataboutery. What we did was we got the job done. We got pace. We did put cash against the issue, but we put pace into it.
It doesn't delay things to make checks. I mean, I've said this before on the programme.
Does, Iain.
Well, no. I texted Matt Hancock. I may have even texted you, Jamie, once or twice at the beginning of the pandemic, where I would have listeners get in touch with me and say, look, I can do this. I can make PPE, or I've got ventilators stuck in China. We need to get somebody to help us get that. Now, I think I did the responsible thing by putting these people in touch with people who could then say to the officials, right, this person says they can do this. It doesn't hold things up very long to actually check that that person is actually telling the truth.
It was a monumental sifting problem because as a local MP, I had hundreds of people coming to me saying that we can do this for ventilators, we can do this for PPE, we can make these things to this standards. All of that got filtered through the Department of Health. It was a huge filtering system. So to imply that there's no admin, there's no delays in that system to actually get the right result, to get the PPE in, to protect our NHS workers who are on the front line, it's just that's unrealistic. It was a big job. We got a lot of money at it. Did we spend everything wisely? Probably not. In fact, undoubtedly, there will be areas where we could have spent in a better way. And the right time for addressing that will be when we do the review. To actually play politics whilst we're at the cusp of coming out of the pandemic is pretty distasteful.
Okay. Alex, thank you very much indeed for your question. I do now remember that you were at the Department of Health because we were going to do a programme, weren't we, from the Department of Health, and then, of course, lockdown scuppered us. How could I forget that? Right, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. 8:48.
This is LBC.
So you now earn me not just one,
McDonald, Ben Everitt, Yasmine, Ahmed and Jamie Njoku-Goodwin with me answering your questions. Joan is in Plymouth and she sent in a text. Do the panel agree that the borders bill put forward by the government is inhumane and excessive and damages our reputation worldwide? Andy McDonald, I'm imagining that you're probably going to say yes.
Well, I'm greatly concerned to see these reports. And I just think we just sometimes lose touch with our humanity. We're seeing people fleeing some terrible situations. And I think we've got a very proud history in our country of offering sanctuary to people who are escaping the most terrible circumstances. I do wish we could have a little bit more of a sympathetic approach to people who are in such desperate straits. I know the argument is that they've passed through a safe country to get to us, and therefore we must shun them. I hear stories about offshoring them for processing in places like Rwanda. I mean, really, is this what we've come to see desperate people treated in such a way? We're very lucky. We're very fortunate to live in such a wonderful country, and we have lots of gifts and benefits. And can we not be a little bit more sympathetic and kinder to people who haven't been as lucky as we are?
I'm going to ask you all to keep your answers very brief on this one so we can fit in one more question before the end. Yasmine.
Yeah, look, just echoing what Andy said, I mean, really, it's really about who we are as British people. Are we the kind of people and are we the kind of government that tells people when they are in need, when they're fleeing persecution, that they cannot come and seek refuge in our country? The Refugee Convention was established after World War II, after the Holocaust and what happened to the Jewish people by the Nazis. And are we saying now that we're reneging on that commitment, that we will never allow people to not seek refuge? And the fact that the UK government are even considering offshore detention, which we've seen in the Australian context and the US context, has only led to harm upon harm upon harm of people committing suicide, families being stripped apart, people being subject to indefinite detention and terrible conditions. The fact that we are even considering that makes me shudder to think, what kind of global Britain are we and do we want to be? This, to me, is one of the very, very lows of our society.
Ben Everitt.
So we were elected to secure our borders, and that's what we're doing. The point about illegal immigration is that it is illegal. There are plenty of ways for refugees to enter our country legally and humanely and with compassion, and those remain open.
True.
But, I mean, isn't it a problem, and I said this to the Immigration Minister, Chris Philp, earlier on this evening, that when we talk about illegal asylum seekers or refugees, we group together anonymous people, whereas if you look at the individual stories that they tell, and when you I mean, I've had lots of people on my programme who've come to this country illegally and tell me why they came, how they came, and what their life has been like since, and generally they're actually very uplifting stories. When you look at it from an individual case point of view, you tend to think, well, yeah, I would have done that too in that situation.
I think there's a hugely humane and moral case for shutting down the illegal immigration business. Those people smugglers are horrible. They are evil people, and that's what we're doing. We're cracking down on the people smuggling.
Jamie.
By putting
it's a difficult balance,
people who
isn't
are
it?
claiming asylum in offshore detention, you are not cracking down. Yes, there should be criminal penalties for people who illegally bring people, but there is no such thing as an illegal refugee or an illegal asylum seeker. There is no line in the world where asylum seekers and refugees stand and wait to come to countries. You are seeking asylum, and by the very nature of that idea and that claim, you are fleeing somewhere. You cannot stay there. You are fleeing a condition. So this idea that people are illegal is completely nonsensical, as is the idea that there is some line that these people should be waiting in. If I am being persecuted, I am seeking refuge. Should the Jews from the Holocaust have waited in a line?
So I find the Holocaust reference relatively distasteful, I have to say, and leaving aside the fact that these people are clearly not fleeing France, what we are doing is shutting down the illegal routes. We're shutting down the people smugglers, these cruel people who prey on vulnerable people, who are quite often fleeing something.
No one's arguing that they aren't evil, but the point surely is that Why should France, Germany, Belgium have to deal with this problem on their own? People want to come to this country. Actually, we should be proud that people want to come to this country. They don't come here, by and large, to fleece the benefit system. There'll always be the odd exception, but most do not. And surely we need to take our fair share. Now, the immigration minister will say we already are.
We do take our fair share. And there are plenty of ways for people who are genuine asylum seekers, who are genuine refugees, to use the systems that are already in place to come to our country. What we are doing is shutting down the system that exploits them, the illegal system that exploits them.
I hate this whole culture of countries passing refugees and sort of people seeking asylum from one to another, and it happens across Europe. I think if you're coming from France, you're not necessarily seeking fleeing persecution in France. I think the UK should be doing so much more to be taking refugees and asylum seekers directly from countries. I think just waiting for people to kind of get across the channel and then having this debate then, I think, is wrong. I think there's often instances of sort of France sort of being happy for people to go through France and try and make their way to the UK, often through the aid of people smugglers and human traffickers, which can put people in horrible situations. But I do think it shouldn't just be this binary question of, do you want more refugees or do you want less? I generally think we should be playing our role internationally and globally and doing much more to take people, often directly from countries where they're facing the direct persecution.
Well, we could talk about this subject for the next hour, and indeed that's exactly what we're going to do after Cross Question. So do stay tuned, because I'd like to hear your views on this new bill which has been put forward by the government today. A quick final text from Jerry in Northampton. Rishi Sunak has just got himself a Labrador. What's your favourite breed of dog? That's the most challenging question. And don't, whatever you do, any of you say, I hate dogs. Andy McDonald.
I think, what they call them, a cockapoo? I think they're the cuddliest looking things, aren't they? Yeah. How about that?
You clearly haven't got one. Yasmine.
Labrador. Definitely.
Okay. I'm thinking, Ben Everitt, you're more of a Jack Russell person.
Oh, no. I know you've got Jack Russells. Yeah. No, I was going to say Labrador, but, given that Rishi's got one and Yasmine's got one, I'll go for Flat Coat Retriever, because they're absolutely nuts and hugely full of character.
Jamie?
My girlfriend is obsessed with Labradors, and so I'm far too smart to say anything other than that.
That's a very wise decision that you have made there. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Andy, Yasmine, Ben and Jamie. Tomorrow, as I say, it's an international edition of Cross Question, so we want all your questions to relate to world affairs. How about that then? Coming up in a moment, we'll get your views on this new Immigration and Borders Bill. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the use of bubbles in schools in England is going to come to the end as final coronavirus restrictions are eased. The Education Secretary has confirmed children will only need to self-isolate if they test positive from August the 16th. COVID-related